I'm using a lot of very subtle, very light washes in this painting because I don't want to have the shadows overpower things. We're gonna really work to keep the stucco facades in this building lighter than they are in the photograph. So I was experimenting with different ways to get real subtle, cool and warm shadow that kind of preserve the subtleness. And we start off with cobalt, and almost all of these have a cobalt base to them, but a very watered down cobalt. And this is just plain cobalt as a wash. I'm going to zoom my camera in a little bit closer so you can see some of this. See if I can straighten it out there. There we go. Um, and then if you add a little bit of either alizarin or opera, which is like a hot pink to your cobalt, you can get a little warmer mix for a sky. It's a little more neutral. It doesn't have quite the harshness that just a straight cobalt does. But I discovered in the last month or two a new color that I've introduced into my palette. And many of you probably might not have this, but I use it sparingly. But it's a wonderful base color. It's a Holbein lavender. I'm sure Daniel Smith and a couple other big manufacturers, Winsor Newton, have a lavender, but you mix the lavender with a little bit of alizarin crimson and a little bit of cobalt, and you get this beautiful, subtle, kind of neutral shadow color. Or if you go in the other direction and you do a cobalt with a little yellow ochre or raw sienna, you'll get a little bit of a warmer mix. And then as you really move into the warms, you start with a little bit of cobalt, maybe add a little raw umber and alizarin crimson. And most of us think of alizarin crimson, raw umber as really dark colors. But if you use mostly water and just a little bit of pigment, you'll get these beautiful, subtle mixes that have a lot of range within them. They run from some warms to some very transparent cools within the wash. And if you think about the patina that you see on a building of a old stucco building that's in shadow, this is a beautiful way to accomplish that. I got down in a little bit darker over here. We had cobalt, some alizarin crimson, and then I've added to my palette some Sodalite Genuine by Daniel Smith. It's just a granulating kind of gray. You can use neutral tint or Payne's gray to get basically the same effect, but very sparingly. You're just using it to neutralize the rawness of the cobalt and the harshness of the alizarin to give a real subtle kind of shadow. And I don't know if you can see this, but there's little tones of warmth coming through this swatch here, and that's what we want to accomplish today. Going across here, we've got some darker ones with cobalt, raw umber, and alizarin. Another mixture that I find always, without fail, it's kind of a safe go-to when you're doing some shadow colors that glow, is take a little bit of raw sienna or yellow ochre, they're basically the same color, and drop in a little bit of cerulean blue. The cerulean blue plays so nice in the playground with the raw sienna. It always has a glowing finish to it. Then I went in a little different direction. I took cobalt and I added a little bit of turquoise light. And the turquoise light is a warmer color. The cobalt adds a little bit of coolness to this, but you get movement within the shape. You can get the same kind of movement, but more dramatic if you use cobalt with a little bit of orange. This is just yellow ochre with some Sodalite Genuine or neutral tint. You get that look. So I just wanted to kind of go through this and show you how you can play around with just scrap paper. Here's another thing where I was just kind of playing around. You could see the subtleties of some of these mixes. And today, what we're going to be doing is really exaggerating the lightness of these stucco facades and letting the rooftops lead the eye through the design. And I took a few liberties from the sketch or from the photograph that we used as a photo reference, but it's pretty true to the photo. This is from San Gimignano, a photo I took a long time ago when I was over there, and basically what we're going to do is try to preserve a very light value for all these facades, and where one or two of these surfaces push back, we'll throw it into a little bit cooler shadow. We may go from a very light and cool facade over on the left And as we gradually move to the right, some of this stucco might take on a little bit warmer cast, but the trees and the foliage down in the foreground and off to the right are going to frame this whole composition. But we have to remember to really start with a very light sliver of cobalt blue for our sky, with maybe a little pink in there. And then as we start moving into the land across below the horizon, we don't really want to have a real harsh separation. We want the sky to kind of very gradually blend right into that background. And gradually, as we come up against both sides of this tower, we want to get a little bit darker with our values. So we make this more of an impressive negative shape that we look at. And when we introduce negative shapes in a painting, that's what draws the attention of the viewer to what you want them to look at. So that's another reason to try to maintain some very light values in all these stuccos, because we're going to create dark with trees, foliage, backgrounds up against the edges of these buildings, keeping them very light, very subtle, and then pop in some really pure orange with just a few little shadows on some of the slopes of the roof that are away from the light source. So the orange of the rooftops, if you look at our photo, you know, it's all kind of dirty and kind of a mid-tone range. And we're going to take some liberties as artists, and we're going to make this a little bit more dramatic. And I think if I show you the photo or the painting that I did as a sample, you can see I've taken some artistic license and made the stuccos a little brighter, a little sunnier, and then the orange rooftops kind of pop then. And that's what we want to try to accomplish today. You can see we're going to have maybe some mist or some very light values running through the fields and the vineyards off in the distance, which makes this feel like we're looking off across this vista, creating atmospheric perspective. Does everybody know what atmospheric perspective is? It's all it is a way to start with a little warmer, darker values nearer the viewer. And as you move farther off into the distance, towards the far horizon, everything starts getting cooler and a little lighter in value. And then the sky is the lightest value altogether. So what that does is it really tricks the viewer into feeling like they're seeing three dimensions. They're seeing the perspective going off into the distance, rather than everything being flat on a two-dimensional surface of paper. So, you know, our job is to be magicians. We're manipulating the viewer's perception of what they're seeing to make it look three-dimensional. And we do this through warm, darker values in the foreground and getting progressively cooler and lighter in value, and then just maybe some of the horizon just disappears into the sky. So that's a prelude to where we're going to be going today. And I want to start off by playing around with our palette. I'm going to zoom my camera out a little bit so you can see my palette. And we're going to mix up a sky color. I'm going to use a mop brush. It holds a lot of water, and it is my friend for something that I want to have real running. And I'm going to start with a little bit of cobalt blue. We'll get a lot of wet on our brush and in the palette, and start mixing up a real thin mixture of cobalt blue. Once I've got a nice big mixing area full of this cobalt blue, I'll rinse my brush a little bit, and I'm going to pick up a little bit of ochre, which is a hot pink. I'm going to add a little bit of that over on the other side. That way I can pick up a little bit of this nice juicy mix of pink and add it a little bit as needed to my blue. But I want to maintain two separate colors so that I can kind of go back and forth as needed. I want to make sure I got plenty of water on my brush, not too much paint. And I'll come back to my painting now and start at the top. And if you notice, I don't know if you can see this, but I've got a fairly narrow roll of tape under my board just to elevate the top of the board. So gravity will pull my pigments down and the water down. And as it rolls downhill, wherever it hits dry paper, it won't go any further. It'll just bead up. So as I come across, I'm just going to make a few little horizontal marks and let the sky or the water in the sky just sort of start running downhill. Now, as it beads up here, I'll take my brush and grab a little bit more of this and just start moving it down, rinse my brush, come across the top of my tower here. I'm going to pick up a little more of that pink and drop some warmth into my sky as it starts coming down towards the horizon. Rinse my brush and just keep running right through the fields and bring it down and make sure I leave the buildings dry, running the wet brush right up against the sketch where I've introduced my building shapes. So I don't want to paint over my buildings. I'm just going to drop some of this wet shape down into the background all the way down to the buildings. And then as I go over to the other side of the tower, I might pick up a little bit darker pigment from my mixing well. This is the cobalt. And I'm just going to drag a little bit of that through some of these areas. Pick up a little bit of pink just to kind of vary the intensity of the blues so that it's not all exactly the same. And this is the reason I had the top of my rooftops fairly well defined, because I knew that I wanted to keep those completely dry as negative shapes to start with. And I can use the tip of my squirrel mop brush to kind of move along the edges of these rooftops, keeping them dry and dropping in this wet paint right above the rooftop. So now basically I've got everything done for my sky. I can now go back and add just a little bit darker blue and a little bit darker pink in maybe a couple spots here. Rinse my brush really well and wipe it off, and then just kind of soften a few of these marks. Now, if I get too much water into this wet paper, it's going to bloom. So I want to make sure that I just very gently kind of introduce some of that other value of pigment in a few spots. So it just looks like clouds, maybe up halfway between the horizon and the top of the paper. And because my board is elevated, that's going to start running downhill a little bit in a few places. It's going to start creating a bloom. If you don't want a bloom there, just take your brush and kind of make sure you wipe all the water off your brush and just soften wherever a bloom starts to occur, and you'll be in good shape. So I'm going to stop there and let you do that. If you need to take a small round and just dampen it, get all the water off of it, you can kind of control the edges right up against some of these rooftops just by bringing some of that tone down up to the white edge or the negative shape of the rooftops just to finish it off. And a small round does the trick, just to kind of feather away the edge, do a little cleanup action as needed. So there's about all I want to do at this point. We'll come back after this totally dries, and I may darken some of the sky or the hills on either side of this tower. But for now, I'm going to take a smaller brush. It's just a little bit smaller squirrel brush, or you can use the one you used before. And I'm going to introduce a little bit of turquoise to my cobalt blue. Let's swing my brush or my camera over here so you can see. I just took that area where I had in my palette with the cobalt, and I just added a little bit of light turquoise to that. And my brush is quite a bit drier than the water. And I'm going to just drop in a few little subtle shapes where the horizon is, not everywhere, but just in a couple of spots. And we'll come back in and leave some other areas with other colors. But for now, while this paper is damp, I'm just dropping in a few little shapes that are subtle. They have a little bit more warmth than the sky. Most of these shapes where I touched near my horizon, they're going to feather out and get very soft. They're not going to be real hard edged out on the horizon. there's just a suggestion of landmass way out there that's slightly darker, a half step darker than the sky itself. And we'll come back and add a little bit more color in a few places, uh, different hues, but also very light in value. I'm going to take a little bit of that lavender we talked about, drop some of that in a couple of spots within that are closer to the buildings, about halfway down through the landmass, and just take my brush, which is slightly damp, and soften a few of these marks. It almost looks a little misty back there. It's not real intense. I'm going to take just a touch of raw sienna, throw a little bit of that into that damp area as we get closer to the edges of the rooftops, because we're closer and we want to have just a touch of warmth in that area. I'm going to add a little bit of raw umber to my lavender here. Now that's too wet, so I'm going to dry that, take a tissue and completely get rid of that. Because if I put that much water on this damp background of my paper, it's going to immediately bloom. So I've dried that puddle. I'll pick up a little bit of raw sienna, a little bit of lavender, and it creates kind of a warm neutral. And you can see it's not real wet. I just ran my finger through it, and all I'm trying to do is not be wetter than the wet of the paper. And I'll just take a little bit of this and throw some of this back into the landmass in the distance there. Just a couple of quick strokes, nothing real defined. It's very abstract. And that's all I want to do at this point. We'll come back in and put some drier marks on this after this dries. But for now, we've done enough for our background and for our hills. I think if I wanted to, I might take a round and take a little bit of turquoise and add it to the raw. No, that's too green. I was trying to see what might work here. I'll take a little bit of the the cobalt and add a little bit of lavender and a little bit of turquoise to that. We'll just see. That's pretty dark, so I'm going to wipe most of that off and just get a little bit. And we'll just throw a little bit of value up against this side of the building. And you can see it's so subtle, you don't even realize that we're getting darker against that building. But just taking some of that value that's on my brush and bringing that right down to a rooftop and allowing it just a couple of marks in this damp area to be soft and feathery. Looks pretty good. So while you've got that going, I'm going to let you finish your background. I know it takes you a while to figure out how and where you want to put all this. I'm taking just a damp flat brush. It's not wet. It's just slightly damp. And I'm softening a few of these edges while we kind of watch what's happening here to make sure everything's going smoothly on our background. I can also take just a little bit more water, not much. And I might throw a little bit of, just take the edge of my brush and lift a little bit of the color that we put into this background. So it's almost like a little bit of mist going through that landmass in the background. And just having that dampness on my brush picks up just a little bit of the soft light values that are wet in the background. I'm going to add just a slight bit of lavender up along parts of my horizon and part of this hill, just not everywhere, but just in a couple of places, just to suggest that there's some maybe some shadows from the clouds that are on the land. And then I just take a clean, damp brush. I rinse my water and I just soften some of these marks so that it's a little bit irregular. It's not real obvious because we're not trying to paint the distant horizon. We're just trying to suggest that there's land back there that is part of the scenery. So this is about where we want to be. We'll put a little bit of warmth and darkness. I'm going to take a little turquoise and some of the cobalt and a little bit of raw sienna. That's pretty intense. There we go. I want to just get a really nice, soft medium light value with just some warmth to it. And come in now into this damp area and just give a few little kind of zigzag shapes that are semi-horizontal to suggest the fields that are going through the background in the distance. And it just builds up a very subtle suggestion that there's some warmth back there. I'm just adding a little bit right up around the tops of this rooftop, right in this little pinch here.
Randy, could you identify what colors you're using?
It was just a cobalt and turquoise and raw sienna, but very little pigment, mostly just a little damp water, not a real wet brush. And if you look back over here, it doesn't, I got too much over here in this thing. So I just took a little of that and mixed it over with some turquoise and a little bit of cobalt. That's probably too much. So I'm going to wipe some of that down. Add a little bit more of this raw sienna. And you get this nice kind of very light mix that has a slight bit of warmth to it, but it's still on the cool side. The reason we still want it to be on the cool side is because it has to be off in the distance. Now I can drop in some of this darker shape. You see how that's a little bit darker now? It's almost like there's some fields off in the distance. And I'm just dropping in a couple of spots just to suggest across some of these little softer areas in the background, some darker shapes. But if you get too dark, too warm, it's going to bring it towards the viewer and feel very close. And we want this to feel very, very distant, off in the distance, very subtle, not real obvious. So I can take just a little bit of lavender and drop it in a couple of spots, rinse my brush, wipe all the water off, and then just soften those marks with just a little bit of a damp brush. And it just suggests like almost like little shadows or something on the far fields without getting too defined. All right, so let's dry that. While we're letting that dry, that's still pretty wet. We'll start thinking about some of our shadows. Now I want to talk strategy here for a moment. We're going to keep the stucco pretty light over on the lower left with just a little bit of cooler lavender type shadows, mixing in with some cerulean and some not cerulean, alizarin crimson and cobalt. But as we start shifting across these facades to the right, I want them to get a little bit more warmth with some raw sienna, but not so much that you'd be able to realize it's raw sienna. It's just very subtle. So I want to use probably a flat brush because these are flat surfaces and it's easier to just drop in some very quick little shapes without overworking it using this medium-sized flat. This is about a 3/4 inch flat. I'll get this a little bit damp and using a lot of the same colors that we mixed up. I want to get a little bit of the alizarin crimson. Let me move my camera over here and I'm going to maybe
Randy, if they don't have raw sienna, what else could they use, please?
Well, yellow ochre and raw sienna are identical. And I use yellow ochre. I used to use raw sienna, but I like the yellow ochre better. But it's just a warm sand color. There, you can see what it looks like. See how that's got some warmth to it. If you were to take, it's a pretty basic color, maybe raw umber and add a little yellow to it, you might be able to do that. But basically, it's a warm beige. Any kind of warm beige that you've got, water it down so it's a really kind of thin mix, very transparent. I'm going to add just a touch of alizarin crimson to that. And that's where I'm going to get some of my neutral. I'm going to add just a touch of the raw sienna to that. I'm sorry, not the raw sienna, the cobalt to that. And you can see it takes it down to a kind of a neutral, very wet mix. As I come back over here, I'm going to tighten up my mouth there so you can see what we're doing. And I will get a little bit of dark up against this rooftop and edge. I'm just going to drop that in there, and I'm going to add a little bit of more of the alizarin crimson and a little bit of the lavender. Wipe my brush off and just allow the brush to kind of move that pigment across the wet shape. And if some parts of it are a little warmer and some parts of it are a little cooler, some parts of it are a little wetter, that's okay. Just let the pigment kind of flow within those surfaces so that we see movement of cools to warms, lights to darks, that sort of approach. I want this outer right edge of the building to be lighter than the background behind it. So I'm picking up a little bit of that paint. So that's one way to get started. I'm going to pick up just a little bit more beige and drop it right underneath the rooftop there. Then we've got a little bit of the same type of thing happening over here with this. I want to get a little cooler. And we're just going to drop in some of the cobalt and the lavender and come around this doorway a little bit. Rinse your brush and just add a little bit of water to the lower edge of that mark so that it just grabs that pigment and starts pulling it down into the wet shape. And you end up with a really nice bit of movement that suggests a bit of a shadow under that overhang. I'll let that dry. I want to give just a very small, light amount of see if I can tighten this up there. A little bit of the raw sienna, very, very wet, very loose and thin mix. And bring that down perhaps to this lower building here, just to kind of suggest a little bit of warmth. And you don't have to be perfect. Just grab your brush and drag it across parts of this surface. Rinse your brush. Soften.
Would you suggest an alternative to an alizarin crimson, please? Somebody's asking.
Say it again.
Do you have an alternative to alizarin crimson, please?
Well, alizarin crimson is a cool red. So if you have a cool magenta, you have a rose or an opera, any of those colors are going to be a cool red. So they'll all work. While that's, we're going to let that dry, and we'll come back in and add some other colors on top of that after that dry. We're going to be bouncing around a little bit on some of these facades because there's some that we want to leave pure white and there's others that we want to introduce a little bit more color to. So I'm going to take a little bit of my alizarin crimson and drop a little darker mix right up underneath here and then above in this other upper shadow that's underneath this rooftop, and I'm going to pick up a little bit of raw sienna as we move to the right across this surface, and I'm just going to drag this across and just let it get very wet and just feather out to nothing on the bottom edge. I just want to keep it subtle, and we're going to leave some white in this area here, and I might add just a little bit of the warmth. Let's see, over in here now, we'll just introduce a little bit of warmth. Take water and push a damp brush up towards that deposit of paint so that it just kind of runs downhill and gets a little cooler as it gets up against this little corner here to define the building separation. And as we come down behind this little rooftop, I want to get that a little bit darker to define the rooftop as a negative shape. I'm going to go right across the door, clean my brush, and just feather that back. We might go back in and pop in a little bit more cool. But what that's doing is it's making this rooftop stand out because we're creating a negative shape there. And it's all very wet. So it's allowing the water to kind of grab that pigment and move it around within the wet puddle and do its own thing. And that's going to look very natural by the time we're done because we've allowed the pigments to mix on the paper and create these secondary and triple color mixes. So we'll leave that kind of like that. We've got another building that's right back in here. One of these, let's see, which one is it? This one here is going to be much deeper in shadow. So I'm going to dry this adjacent building, let it dry, and then drop in some cooler um, pigments in this little recessed area to make it feel like it's moving back into the distance a little bit more. And we just pop these down like so, and then just pick up a little bit of whatever raw sienna you have and just get it warmer as it comes towards the other building to the right. And then I can even take a little bit of that alizarin crimson and drop a little bit of that into this corner just to make it a little more dramatic. And these are really subtle, wet shapes. They're just not that that dark. You know, it's mostly dirty water, but there's enough difference in tints in there between the alizarin crimson, the raw sienna, a little bit of the cobalt, that we get a tremendous amount of variety within these shadow shapes. But now that pushes that whole facade back and allows these adjacent to it to come forward. I want to get a little bit darker. Let's see if we can add a little bit of alizarin crimson right up behind this. I'm going to rinse my brush now and just allow the water to grab that pigment that I just deposited and let it move across these surfaces so that we really feel that cool, dark come right up around this building. And I'm just playing with this wet shape to push that color back and make that building facade recede back into the shadows back there. Put a little bit of warmth with some raw sienna back in there. And just because this is all wet, I can drop in different colors and you'll get a little splash of warmth, you'll get a little splash of cool, you'll get a little splash of the reddish, the cool reds up here. All of these things are working together to create the impression of a different depth within this recess of the shadows. So there, we'll let that kind of just sit tight. And as all of these buildings start to come forward, they're going to get lighter and lighter. They're going to get whiter and whiter where the sun's on them. But I wanted to drop in some of these shadows initially to establish those recesses. Now this guy's way back in the shadows over here. He's on the far end of the buildings. He might even be in the shadow of this tower. So now that that's dry, I want to come back in with even darker, cool colors and just build this up a little bit and create a negative shape for the rooftop that's closer to us. And just take a little bit of water and dampness on my brush and feather that right edge of that mark. And now all of a sudden that building just pops as it moves back away from us into the distance. I'm adding a little bit of raw sienna just to warm up the surface on the right side, but I'm leaving the cooler color on the left side, which is back in shadow. And now this little shadow that's running across here, I'm just darkening the left side of it just a little bit. And we'll come down after that dries.
Can you explain what the darker colors are that you're using, please, Randy?
They're just more, I'm using the exact same palette of colors. It either has less water or more water. In this case, this was a little bit of raw sienna with less water in it. We had the alizarin crimson and cobalt and lavender mixture, which was just right here in my palette, just a bunch of wet pigment that's mixed together. And if I have more water on my brush, it goes down very light. If I wipe my brush off and I have less water, I'm picking up more pure hue and I can lay that into the shape to make it more obvious. So it's just a matter of how much or how little water you use to get the point across with making a transparency. I'm trying to get this
That's it.
evened up in your screen. All right, so now let's think about where we're going. I think I dropped something on my paper there, just a droplet. I'm just going to take my brush and just eliminate it. If you ever dribble or drop or have a drop of paint fall on your wet area, just rinse your brush, wipe most of the water off, and just very lightly just pick up whatever might have been a kind of a mistake And we all do that. I mean, you're moving your paintbrush back and forth from your palette to your painting. You're dragging your brush over the top of your painting. It's inevitable you're gonna drip or dribble something on your work. Don't sweat it. Just pick it up and move on. And you can go back in and decide, all right, I'm going to add a little more dark here. So I'll just get more cobalt and add it to whatever the mix is. And I'm going to put a little bit of a chimney or something back in here. We'll just make it a little darker. Doesn't matter what it is. Clean my brush and just take the right side of that mark and just feather it back into where the tree shapes are going to be. So I don't have a hard edge there. It just kind of disappears. All right, let's think now a little bit about these buildings down here. We want to leave them predominantly white negative shapes, but in a couple of places, we want to introduce maybe a little bit of pink with our cobalt. It's going to be a very cool color that's probably a little dark, so I'm going to add water to that. Add a little bit more pink. See how that turns to a really beautiful lavender, a very clean lavender look. That's going to promote the impression that we're keeping it pretty cool against these white surfaces. And I'm only going to put a little of this color in a couple of spots as they come down behind some of these buildings, just in shadow, the shadow part of the building. I don't really want to get too much going on, maybe a little bit underneath this awning here. Come down into this area and then rinse my brush, maybe add a little bit of warmth now as they come out of that shadow into the bounce light, and we start just softening some of this around some of the rooftops. I want to get darker, and I'm going to use alizarin crimson and the lavender to get down inside this little doorway area here. There's a vestibule or something. It doesn't really matter what it is, but it's in shadow. So we want to make it a little darker as it comes down against these rooftops. That feels too dark. So I'll just rinse my brush and wipe my brush off and just use it to pick up a little bit of that pigment and allow it to kind of find its way down the facade. I'm going to add just a touch of this right along the edge of the building and then up, down, underneath this arch. We'll just add a little bit of the lavender with some raw sienna into it to make it a little darker. There's a little archway. Maybe we've got a little bit of that same color on the other side. I'm going to rinse my brush and pick up the pigment down at the bottom of that mark so that it stays darker right at the top where it disappears under that arch. Leave that alone. Maybe a little shadow under this, real subtle, not much, just a little bit of shadow underneath some of these rooftop edges. I'm going to put a little bit there. Pick up just a little bit of blue on the left side of this closest to the light source, and then bring some of this down along the edge to show that this facade is sticking back behind this one that's closer to us. Remember, the rooftops themselves are where the warmth is going to be. We just want to give a very subtle bit of shadowing on some of these surfaces. I've got a drain pipe coming down this side here, so I'm just going to throw a little bit of dark. I just took whatever was in my palette here and less water, and just touch. If you remember, I just used raw sienna here initially. So by putting anything in here underneath this rooftop, it's going to create a bit of a shadow that's cooler. And I'll just bring that right on down with a touch of alizarin crimson in that blue mix to make it kind of a neutral. There's a little shadow behind that drain pipe. And we got one over here. We'll do a little bit of that as well. We've got a little ledge or something goes across this building. We'll put something in there to kind of define that edge, maybe come in underneath these rooftops with a little more defined shadow lines. And you can see the paper's still wet where I touch this with this fairly dry paint, it feathers out. It doesn't go anywhere. It just stays there. But it makes for a nice colorful shadow that has some warmth to it, has some coolness to it. It has a glowing effect, but we're just going to leave that kind of like it is right now. Now, I think what we'll do is we'll dry that and give you a chance to play with this a little bit. You're the designer. You get to design these shadows. The main thing you want to think about is if some of these surfaces are pushed back and recede into the shadows, there's going to be a little bit more shadow. The edges are defined a little bit more. And then the surfaces that are coming towards us, towards the viewer, we want to leave them as a lighter negative shape, so they feel like they're coming closer. This has a bit of a balcony here. I could always take the colors I've been using, and I'm basically sticking with pretty much the same colors, and I can put a little bit of shadow where this balcony might be, and then pick up some warm tones and allow it to get a little warmer after we emerge from the shadow. I can go back and add just a touch of darker, whatever I have in my palette, and make this a little darker right up underneath the balcony where it creates that shadow coming down across there. We could do a little bit more of that in a couple of spots underneath these rooftops. But I like to just take a damp brush and soften some of these shadows, because they just kind of flow across the surface, and it just creates that impression of a softer surface. So I'll dry this, and then we'll work on the tower before we handle the vegetation. I'm trying to use a heat gun because it's a little quieter than a hair dryer. If you're muted, you could use your hair dryer and get this dry pretty quickly, so that you can continue moving right along through this painting. Now, some of you may be asking, well, how am I going to hold the edges of some of these things as negative shapes? I've already planned to come in with some darker vegetation around the bottom and the left and behind these rooftops. Over here, we've got a really large tree. Part of it will be very warm on one side, but then it transitions into shadow and becomes a very dark, cool color. And to keep this pretty abstract, I'll throw a little bit of water into the wet pigments and let the water bloom and create these little dewdrops. I'm going to flip back to my painting here. If you see what I've done with some of these, just throwing a little bit of water onto a really dark, cool pigment. When the paper's wet, the pigment's wet, and it's a rich dark, and you throw a little bit of pure water on there with a rigger, you get these little explosions of dewdrops that suggest lots of texture. You can also throw a little splatter in later after it dries, but it gives a very fluid, kind of loose quality to the vegetation, so that it doesn't draw attention to it. It just creates a nice dark that pushes up against these edges, and you can come back in and darken while this is a little damp, and drop in even darker, drier paint to create contrast with the edges of your building. Now, looking at this, these buildings jump right off the page. But if you go back to where we are currently, everything's a light value. We're not seeing that. So we have to visualize where we're going in our plan to come back in and put some darks with the vegetation to make the white facades pop out. The orange rooftops they have a very important role in also doing the same thing on capping these vertical facades. But before we get to that point, now that this is fairly dry, I'm going to come back in and take a kind of a little warmer approach to my tower. This tower here that I painted, you can see it's got some very subtle raw sienna tones. It's mostly water in here, but there's just enough dirty water there that it gives a sense that there's some surface without it just being a flat white shape. It still is a negative shape, but it's got movement across it. And then we've got some little cornices and architectural features that we can put slight shadows underneath as well. But that usually is done after it's had a chance to dry. So let's mix up in my palette a little more of the raw sienna. I'm going to come up in this area up here, just throw a little bit of that raw sienna into that area that I had some alizarin crimson already mixed. So it kind of pinks up, gets a little pinkish in tone with the raw sienna. Come back to my painting, and basically I'm going to get enough water on here so I don't really kill it, and I don't worry about the windows or any of that at this point. I just want to create a little bit of a value coming down against that light sky up on this side, and just drag it right diagonally across the surface of this building. Then rinse my brush. I've rinsed my brush. I kind of blotted all the dampness off my brush, and I just start feathering the right side of that stroke as we come down diagonally. And we start to get nearer this rooftop that's closer to us. What do we have to do? We have to introduce some of the cool colors, some of the alizarin and lavender and cobalt, and allow those to get darker as they push up around some of these little smokestacks or chimneys. And all of a sudden, this building starts to get darker as it comes in contact with the rooftop. And all it suggests, as we mix up just some junk in our mixing well, just slightly darker value, and I'm dropping that into this damp shape right up against the rooftop, because what it's going to do is it's going to give us the impression that this tower is tucking in behind this other building. Now I've got some little splotches of color on this roof. I'll clean that up later, but at the moment I just want to maintain this kind of warm facade that comes vertically down the surface of this building, and let it get a little bit darker as it drops in behind this other rooftop. I'm just taking a little splash of some raw sienna in a couple places, just letting it kind of soften in within this wet shape. Every painting you do, whether you do this painting 20 times or 2 times, they're never going to be the same. You get the opportunity to kind of experiment and try different things, see how it works. If you think it's too dark, or you want to brighten up this left side, just take a tissue while it's wet and just blot it a little bit. All of a sudden that picks that pigment up. And when we can come back in later, it darken our background to make more of a contrast. So it's just a matter of playing with the values and playing with those wet shapes. I've got some, I think if you remember in our photo reference, we've got some little scallops or something, architectural features. I'll zoom down so you can maybe see this in the top of the cornice on this building. I don't want to be real obvious with that. I want to just create sort of a suggestion. So I might take my small round at this point and get a little bit cooler color, maybe a little bit of cobalt added to the raw sienna mix and a little bit of the alizarin crimson. And I might just put a few little divots in there. That's probably too strong. So I'll just take my brush and knock a little bit of the water, rinse it in the water a little bit, and soften this, and then go back to my colors and maybe have a few more of those going across the top. They don't have to be perfect. I think a lot of times we think every painting has to be absolutely perfect. The looser they are, the more impressionistic they become with the wet and wet application of paint, the more realistic it becomes, because we're allowing the viewer the opportunity to see with their mind and envision what they recall some of these features look like. I'm just adding a little bit of dark underneath this while it's wet. My board's elevated, so these colors kind of flow downhill. But I've got warm raw siennas, I've got cool cobalts, I've got alizarin crimsons in here. All of it's running together in a wet shape that allows these colors to meld and mingle and neutralize themselves, so it feels very natural. It's like light playing across the surface of a building. But now that it's wet like that, we have to move on. We can't really play with that anymore because it'll just start blooming. So where do we go next? Well, this is where you get to have a little fun. You kind of decide what you want to do. And in my case, I think what I may do is come back in and start laying down a base color for some of the vegetation to capture the left side. And the reason I'm coming over here is I want the right side of the painting to dry. So I move to an opposite side. You will find that if you move around in your painting, you don't have to stop and wait for a hairdryer. You can be painting over on the left side, and you will allow another part of your painting to dry naturally. If you really want to work here, you could take a hairdryer and dry that. But in my case, what I'm thinking now is, what do I do with these trees? I want to keep them cool. So I'm going to use like a Prussian blue. Let me get back so you can see in my palette. I picked up a little bit of a cool color. It's dark. That's pretty wet. I could take just a touch of sap green and add to that. If you have a color like Indrathine, that does the same thing. This color I'm using is a royal blue by Holbein, but it's basically a Prussian blue. And you can see how dark it goes. But if you add just a little touch of the sap green, it warms that up just imperceptibly. But I can come back now to my painting, and using my brush, I can just put a few little loose strokes and then use my flat on my brush to come right down against the top of that roof and use this to really carve out that negative shape. And I've got a good sketch here laid in that defines the rooftops. And I'm not worried about, just how accurate all this this tree stuff is. I just want to make sure I carve in around the rooftops to make sure I've got a really nice dark up against my my buildings, because that's where the contrast has to be. So I'm just bringing this down, and I'll just go back with my brush then and just loosen this up out around the upper edges of these treetops. They're not that important. What's important is getting the darks with a little drier paint right up into some of these little pinches to define the shape of the roof. I'm going to rinse my brush and just add a little bit of water now to these darks, and let the water kind of pull that pigment down and around some of these buildings. And that's kind of cool. I'd rather warm that up a little bit. So I'm going to drop a little bit of sap green in there in a couple of spots, so that because it's already wet, it'll just grab that green and start moving it into the blues. And I don't have to worry about, getting it be a perfect mix. I just want to have a nice soft green area back in there. I'm going to take some of that blue and I want to pull it up into that background area so that I can create this nice just random shape of dark. If I want, I can take a little bit of raw umber, drop a little bit of that in there as well, and let that just kind of mix with all the other colors. And it just adds to the dark. And maybe I use the top of my brush to create what might be the top of a tree in there, another tree or something. I don't want to get it too obvious. I just want to have a variety of shapes. And then I can take a little bit of water and just sprinkle a little water in there and see what happens. You have to be patient and let it have a chance to kind of take over and do its thing. So that's created some nice dark that defines the edges of these buildings. And then we'll probably come back over here while we're watching this to see how this dries. And it's important that you don't lose track of what's happening with your darks that are real wet and juicy and flowing, because sometimes they may do strange things and you have to go back with a brush and just kind of manipulate it a little bit. I'm not worried about this. I think it's fine. But some of that dark seems to be very predictable. I'm breaking up some of it just to so it doesn't look like I just dropped a big blob of dark blue along the edge of a building. So that's fine. We're going to continue on down around the bottom edge of this later, so that I can have these trees flow. I'm going to take this edge and just soften it so it doesn't dry as a hard line, which would be very obvious later. So I just take a brush and just kind of scrub it out and soften it, bring it into the foreground. And we'll come in with some darker colors later. So let's think about now going to the other side of the painting and decide what we're going to do with these trees. I talked about having them much warmer on the left side of the tree because the light source is coming from the upper left to the lower right, which means that this big pine tree that's sitting here in the lower right foreground is going to be very warm on the sun-kissed side. So I'm going to take a little bit of golden green, which is a very warm color. I'm going to swing over so you can see what I'm doing. See this color? It's like an apple green. I'm just going to throw that in with the raw sienna mix that I had here originally with a little alizarin crimson. It makes it pretty warm, but it's not raw pigment. I'll come back in and I'm just going to use the tip of my squirrel mop and just throw some rough shapes outward to create the outer edge of these trees. And this is a big puddle. I mean, there's just a big puddle of pigment sitting here. And I'm working my way down the edge of this tree. I'm going to rinse my brush and pick up a little bit of that cobalt or Prussian blue and the sap green and drop some of this dark into that puddle that's already there in the apple green and dry my brush and maybe get some really dark, pigments in a couple spots here and let it touch some of the wet areas. Pick up a little bit of raw umber. This will neutralize that and give it sort of a really nice granulated effect. Pick up a little bit more of the sap green and a little bit of maybe ultramarine, any kind of a blue, it doesn't matter. And I'm just going to get a few tops of the edges of the tree. So we see a few darks coming out of these warmer areas, and then they just become part of the shadow shapes. And I want to drop in some pretty wet darks in here with some greens, some sap green and some Prussian blue, and just allow this to come down into the foreground. But that is just incredibly wet puddle of pretty dry paint. That's a contradiction. It's a very saturated mixture of dark pigment that's wet. And because it's so wet, I can come back in a minute after it settles down and drop in some water and really warm it up. I'm going to rinse my brush now and go back to my lighter colors and create some really warm colors that are coming down across the bottom of the painting because they're getting a lot of nice sunlight. And I'll be able to drop in some cooler colors in that warm mix as I move across, maybe a little cerulean. We'll just drop some cerulean here and there. Maybe I've got some of these little poplar trees that pop up, have that nice spear shape to them. Pick up a little bit of the green, and we've got another one over here that's a little bit more neutral. But then I'm going to just take my brush and drag some of this across, mostly water now on my brush, kind of smoothing this all out. But once it's wet, I can come back in with some turquoise, drop a few colors in there, maybe a little bit of the apple green color, drop some of that in a few spots. I might even take a little bit of lemon yellow and drop that in, see what happens. We'll just see how just having water drop into that tree immediately moves the pigment around. So we'll let that just kind of run downhill and see what happens. While we're watching this, take a tissue and make sure you wick up any excess paint that's collecting along the tape on the outer edge so it doesn't creep back into your painting and sabotage anything later. But I want to take my flat and allow myself to probably get a little cerulean blue in here and maybe just add a few little softer shapes with a cool color. And the cerulean blue does a nice job of that. I might even pick up a little bit of the Prussian blue in a couple spots. You can see that just really starts to define the shape of a tree without being too specific. And I can come back in on some of these trees that are dark up against the building facade. I can put a few darks on the shadow side of them because they're still wet. And we'll just drop that in there. And over here, we'll do a little bit more. We'll put some shadow shapes on a few of these tree areas. I'm going to take a small round, or you can take a rigger. Either one's fine. Put a little fresh water on there and just tap a little bit and hold it very loose and just slightly tap it with your forefinger of your left hand and just drop some of this water into these tree shapes. And it will just do its own thing. It'll start blooming, it'll start moving paint around, it'll start creating this really fluid flow of pigment. This is a little bit light in here, so I'm going to get a little bit of cerulean and a little bit of raw sienna. So I've got sort of a neutral green color, and just add a little bit of color that might be on the shadow side of some of these trees to suggest shape. And we'll just let the water kind of move through this, see what happens. You can't always predict exactly what's going to occur, but you can always just watch it and see how it develops, because this is part of the process of letting water do the work. You want to always let water have the opportunity to move the pigment around naturally on your paper so that you get this fluid look of watercolor. Now the trees back here are about the same value as what's in the foreground. I'd like to get them just a little cooler and a little darker. I don't think I want to get too dark. So I'm going to use cerulean and drop a little bit of this into parts of this just to darken it against the edges of the building in a couple of spots. I like the warmth that we've got in some of these. So I'm just going to hit it with a very quick stroke. That's about all you need. Just take a damp brush and smooth some of those out. That just helps cool that off. It's not a real, vibrant green. It's more of a bluish, and that pushes it back. We've got warmer greens, more obvious greens down in the foreground, which brings them closer to the viewer. But I've also accentuated them with a little bit of darks here and there.
Randy, could you repeat your green mixtures, please?
Let's start with over here. It's mostly the cerulean blue, a little bit of Prussian blue. I don't think I had a whole lot of green. I might have had a little bit of sap green in one or two brush strokes, but for the most part, it's all just a very cool kind of mid-tone cerulean blue, Prussian blue, touch of sap green. As we got down into the foreground, I used more of that apple green with a little bit of Prussian blue to capture the tops of some of these trees to make them more of a silhouette standing up against these lighter facades. As you get into this big tree over on the right, I started with that apple green color. It's a golden green, or if you can use a cadmium green light, those are all very warm apple green colors. And I worked my way down the right side of the tree just with a very wet brush. I used a squirrel mop, if you recall, which holds a lot of water, which when it's mixed up with that apple green pigment with a little cerulean blue in it, it just really sits there as a wet shape. And then on the right side, I came in with Prussian blue, a little bit of sap green, different colors. And because my paper tended to buckle a little bit here, all that water started flowing downward. And it just sort of reinforces the shape of the tree. And that was strictly the water running downhill in my paper. A lot of times you can't exactly predict what it's going to do. In this case, it did something that I hadn't really envisioned, but I'm going to go with it because I like what it created. Now that the paint has had a chance to kind of settle down in a few places and start to lose a little of the shine, I'm taking some pure water and dripping it into little droplets into that wet shape, and it will start repelling the darker pigments and creating these little snowflake blossom shapes, if you were. And that also suggests texture of a tree without having a lot of brush strokes. The only brush strokes we have that are obvious are the outer edges of the tree. Everything else is just sort of the water moving the pigment around, creating these natural textures. So That's probably a
Can I
good
interrupt
place.
for one moment? There's somebody who's still concerned about how the lavender colour was created. Could you just reprise that, please?
Oh, if you want to get a lavender color, just take like a hot pink. It's opera and cobalt. And depending on how much water you put into it and how much cobalt versus pink, you can get it to be a very cool color, or you can get it to be a very warm color if you add more of the cool reddish pink color. But those two colors, cobalt blue and either a alizarin or or a opera, which is like hot pink, will make a beautiful lavender.
Thank you.
I'm tipping my board up to get some of this pigment to move off to the right a little bit, to the darker pigment. Um, I'm working on 140-pound paper, so it tends to soak up all that water very quickly and then create a little buckling. Just even the slightest bit of buckling, the water will find a path and go downhill. And that's what's happening. It's creating this vertical shape, which is also part of a tree. Trees grow vertically, so I'm not objecting to that at all. Um, we're going to kind of conclude the first half of this thing by getting the framing done, the background done, and some of these facade shadow shapes done before we go in and put windows and doors and chimneys and rooftops and all the detailing. That'll be the second half of the painting. But this is the stage where we want to really get our very light valued, very subtle shadow shapes on these facades, leaving some of them pure white. Others have a little bit of coolness to them that suggests maybe there's some patina or shadow on the building. After we get the rooftops done, the windows done, we may come back and say, you know what, I want to punch up a shadow on one of these facades a little bit more. But at this point, everything is very light, and it gives us a chance to kind of evaluate the values in our painting without getting too far ahead of ourselves. So this is kind of like the base coat of the painting. We've got it about half done. We need to start evaluating whether or not our negative shapes are standing out as strong shapes, and we do that by putting some really loose darks. In this case, they happen to be vegetation, but it's just a device to hold our negative shapes of the buildings, and we're calling them trees, but they're loose and they're light, and I mean they're dark, and that creates the lightness of the negative shape, which comes forward towards the viewer. So at this point, if you want to take your dryer, if your painting is still really wet, which mine is, I'm going to use this heat gun and try to see if I can accelerate some of the evaporation of the water. Those of you who are in more humid climates, the drying time takes a little longer. Usually when it's a dry climate, it dries pretty quick, but in this case, I still see a pretty good shine on the surface. It's starting to go to a matte finish now. And I'm going to zoom in on this so you can see this tree, how that bit of sprinkled water that I threw on this really dark, rich pigment that was very wet. You see how that created all these really interesting kind of soft, feathery shapes, and some of them are lighter. There's some dark holes in this tree where there's shadows. I didn't paint that. That was just throwing some dark paint on there and then letting some pure water hit that and repel some of the pigment. And it creates this beautiful loose abstraction that we interpret as vegetation or tree shapes. And it's a beautiful way to allow the viewer to see the more architectural features, the man-made features, the harder edged features that will emerge from the building. And that all this tree stuff does is it pushes our eye towards what's recognizable. If we tried to paint individual strokes for the boughs of the trees, it would distract from what we're trying to emphasize as a painting, which is the shape of the rooftops kind of leading the eye up to our center of interest. So how are we doing on time, Lois? When do we need to take a little break? Are we? All right, so now it's time to kind of look at my background. It's all dry. We've got some nice distant hills, but I want to create a little more transition from this middle ground to the far ground. So I'll take my flat brush, get it nice and clean. I just rinsed it in my water really well. Kind of tapped off all the excess water. And I want to create just a bit of maybe some of this green. Let's try a little bit of that up here in the upper corner of my mixing well. And that's warmer. And I want to drop in just a few little shapes back in here, particularly as they come down towards the building. Rinse my brush, soften these little shapes. So we really don't see any hard edges. We just kind of have a feeling that they get a little bit, what do you call it, warmer as they're coming towards us. Now I just dropped in a little bit of raw sienna into that wet shape. And you can see it just sort of feathers away. I'm going to take a little bit on the other side of this chimney so I can really create a negative shape for that chimney. Rinse my brush and just soften the upper marks or the upper edges of these marks, leaving a few things a little harder edged. Maybe pick up a little bit of that yellowy apple green. Drop some of that in there along with some cooler color. Maybe these are groves of trees off in the distance. We don't really need to know what they are. We just want to see a variety of shapes that suggest there's lots of terrain off in the vista in the distance. And we'll leave some white, areas in there that are misty. I want to come in with just some really subtle, cooler colors now and create a bit of a shadow or a cooler mark back in a couple spots back here. Take my damp brush and soften the upper edges of that. Over here on this side of the of this tower, I would like to get this much darker so we have greater separation in value. So I'm going to come across the top of this and introduce maybe a little bit of cobalt and a little bit of alizarin crimson. See if you can see that's way too dark, but if I add water to that, I've got a neutral that's really sort of a blue-gray. And I'm going to drop that in right above the rooftop and chimney. Clean my brush and soften all these marks, the upper edges of these marks, so they just blend back into the distance. Take water, or a clean brush rather, and just drop some water into that pigment, and it'll just feather it away and create little blooms. But I want to get a little darker up here towards my horizon. On either side. Now, I wipe all the water off my brush and I just soften the bottom edge and the upper edge of this so it just kind of disappears. And we may need to come back in and darken that again after we get everything else done. But I wanted to just right now get a little bit darker up against that tower to make the tower feel like a brighter negative shape. We can even come down into this area and get this little bit of fields and things that are off in the distance. Maybe, the clouds are casting some shadows across the land. But everything's pretty subtle, even though we're darkening the value up against the building. And these are little adjustments that you want to make the everything more important in the distance. we'll just let that be, because the more you pick at it, the worse it gets. So we just let the water move things around, and we'll live with what we have. We don't want to get it to overpower the painting. We want it to feel like it's disappearing off into the distance. So check your painting, everything's dry. I think we're probably about ready to go into putting in a few windows and doors maybe. For that, I find that a rigger works pretty well. The more carefully you paint windows, the less real they look. So it's better if you just take a pretty loose approach to your window shapes. And in this case, I'm going to take some burnt sienna and a little bit of ultramarine blue. Let me see if I can get my camera. So maybe even cobalt blue, and a little bit of burnt sienna makes for a nice rich dark, kind of a lively dark. You can even add a little orange to it if you wanted to. But as I come back to the painting, I've got a couple of these guys that are pretty, dark little windows. I'm just going to drop in a little mark here and leave some of the structure that's separating these windows, like a little pillar there. Clean my brush, and I might even just drag some of this color right, just lose the edge of that altogether, drag it into the shadow underneath this awning. Just softening some of these marks. Take a little bit of the blue, drop that in there. Go back to that dark that I mixed up. See that I've still got plenty of it in my mixing well. And I'll come back in now and maybe put a window up in here, maybe a window here. There's a window over in this corner. Maybe there's just a couple of dots of windows coming across here. Got something up, and I'm not trying to be real perfect. The pencil lines are fine. They're going to disappear, and we just need to see just a slight suggestion of where there might be some shapes within these building facades. I'm going to go to an orange color that's a little brighter and do this door right in here. It's kind of a different material, but then I want to clean my brush and just push a little bit of the water on my brush up against that deposit of orange so that it stays dark on one side, but on the other side, away from the light, it gets a little lighter. And so it gives you movement within there. I'll go back and get maybe a true Prussian blue now, and maybe just add a little kind of a mark up underneath the header of this window. Rinse my brush completely and push a little bit of water up towards that header. Lift up some of that intense pigment of blue, so I get an opportunity to add just a little bit of orange into it. Rinse your brush and just leaving the darkest dark up at the top, right underneath the header, and allowing for movement within the rest of the window opening. And we've got different size windows. I'm just putting down a little bit of Prussian blue in each one of these. And while those are still wet, I'll rinse my brush and maybe get some orange and drop a little of that down towards the bottom of the window opening. So I get different colors within those window openings. And I can just throw a little bit of water onto those openings with the tip of my brush, adding clean water to those colors. Go back to your mixing well, just pick up a little bit more pigment wherever you feel you need to add. Well, those darks against that light facade are going to really pop, and you may want to kind of dilute some of them. And while the water starts to dry a little bit, or the damp shape starts to dry, you can go back in with a drier pigment that's darker. Maybe you pick up a little bit of sap green or something, and you just drop a little pigment into the top of one of these openings in a couple of spots, just to darken it with whatever you find in your palette. It doesn't matter. You're just introducing different colors. Maybe you pick up a little bit of alizarin crimson and you drop that into one of the window openings. Clean your brush, get a little bit more of the blue and come in the bottom part of that window opening. Clean your brush again and just pick up all that paint at the bottom of the window so it's darkest at the top. If you have to wipe all the water off your brush, do that. Just allow yourself the freedom to be able to try different colors within these dark, wet shapes. Because the more rigid and repetitive you are with all the same color, it's going to look unnatural. It's going to look like you had one color in your palette and that's all you had to work with. So if you can try different colors, try different intensities, and drop different things within some of these wet shapes, all of a sudden your windows take on a lot of variety without a lot of detail. I'm going to put a little dark up in this window opening here, a little bit more dark over on this side. And all of these things just suggest that there's stuff going on back in those little holes, those little crevices, those little areas, and we don't know what they all are, but just the fact that there's little chatter of color sort of suggests that there's a lot of activity, a lot of detail, a lot of stuff going on that we don't really know what it is, and it leaves it to the viewer's imagination. They start to imagine different things. They may have visited a place like this at one time, and they bring their own experience to the table so that it becomes their painting, and they are an active participant in your story that you're telling. And again, if you try to be too careful with these windows, they're going to look kind of like little postage stamps that you put on there. So you want to try to just give a suggestion of darks here and there without it being too obvious. Some of these are going to be pretty light. There may be some stuff down here in the bottom that's barely there. Maybe we just have a few little shapes here and there. This window here, I'm going to get, this is a pretty front and center, so we'll be a little more careful with the shape of this, but then come in with some darks right up in the upper corner so that window opening really feels like it's got some depth to it. And we'll come back in and put some shutters and things on some of these window openings. But for now, we've got some nice things occurring. I'm going to put a little dark in a couple more places here, a few here and there. And we, without dragging your hand through your painting, try to get some nice dark with some orange and some Prussian blue. It's going to give you a really lively dark. And I'm using my rigger now, and very carefully, these 4 arches that are at the top of this tower are really kind of the important center of interest, mainly because they're the darkest dark against the lightest lights. And I'm just going to drop in some color, and then I'll come back and add some secondary color down towards the bottom of these shapes so that it isn't all exactly just a flat color. As we get farther over to the right, we have less intensity, we have more warmth, and that would be orange. And I'm using orange because we're going to have orange in our rooftops, and mixing orange with some of our darks will help give the color unity to the whole thing. We'll still feel that orange within the different darks that we're using. There's just a little pillar between these window openings. And get some more orange in here. We'll just, that orange next to the blue will give a sort of a glow by the time we're done. And if they don't turn out to be perfect, shaped, don't worry about it. It's not the end of the world. It's your painting. It's loose. It's interpretive. And that's the whole point of the exercise, is to try to get some darks going on that are just kind of interesting and gives us an opportunity to think about what might be going on. I'm going to take a tissue and just blot a little bit of that dark pigment off of those windows so we feel like there's a bit of a glow in that opening. And then using a little bit of that burnt sienna orange color, I'll just come in underneath some of these windowsills here. And there's a little bit of a cornice going across, architectural feature. And I'll take a really small, flat, any kind of a small brush that you can control the edge, and I'm going to push a little bit of clean water up towards that little deposit of paint. I don't want to pull it down. I want to push the water up towards it, because I want the darkest part of that to remain right underneath that little cornice. And if I pull my brush down, I'm dragging that pigment down away from where it's casting its shadow. So you want to try to push a damp brush up towards it to soften those edges. I can take my rigger, take a little bit of dark, and there's some little drain holes on the side of this facade. We can throw those on here just like that. Clean your brush, push your brush towards the bottom of those marks. You may or may not get it to trickle down the surface of the building, sort of like watermarks where it's draining, but it softens it. And then as we go back up to the top of the building, I'm going to take that orange again and come right along underneath this cornice with a few little lines of just like a liner, and drag that in there, and then just take my damp brush and push a little bit of clean water up towards the underside of that mark, so that it looks like some of this is just kind of running down the side of the facade, like water has left stains on the building. How often have we seen that, you know, in buildings? And I might even take a little bit of green mossy color here and just drag a little of this against that light sky, so that we go from a light value to a dark value, and then this all of a sudden turns into this negative shape of the building. But there's kind of our interpretation of the top of this tower. And I think we'll soften the opening, the windows a little bit, and maybe some more dark in there if we need to. This guy needs a little more dark. We'll just, it's all about making little adjustments, playing with the openings. But these window arches are really kind of a very unique feature of this tower that makes it pretty interesting. All right. I'm going to let that dry, and we'll see where we stand with some of these shadow shapes at this point. So we'll let that have a chance to, we might come back in and darken a few edges, but I think we're close. We might take a look at some of our shutters. If you have a small flat, that's a great tool. Otherwise, a small round will do. But I'm going to mix up a little bit of sap green. Sap green is a really warm, yellowy green. It's not a viridian. Viridian is a very cool green. This has got a lot of yellow in it, so it's a brighter color. I'm going to add a little bit of cool yellow, and you can see it just makes a really bright yellow, or a yellowy green. And I'm using that on my brush. See if I can get this down. I've got a little bit of it on the tip of this brush. I'm just going to create just a few little marks where we've got a little bit of green going on, and then soften some of these green marks so they almost just blend right into the building a little bit. But these are our shutters in a couple of spots, and they don't have, the more perfect you make them, the worse they look. So I'm going to add a little cerulean blue up in the shadows to these guys, so that we just have a little cooler interpretation, maybe a little turquoise in there as well. This has got some turquoise on the green. I'm using it's probably about 1/4 of an inch wide flat. I found this brush in my basket of brushes a while back, and I go, why not? Let's use that. So I can add a little bit of turquoise, which I've got on this, to that warm green, and it just alters the green so it's not all exactly the same color. There's nothing worse than having the whole painting be all exactly the same color. And I'm just trying to soften up some of these green shapes here a little bit. I've got some nice big windows down here on this facade with some shutters on them. And I'm just throwing in a little bit of dark here and there, just to kind of create the impression that maybe there's some shadows be underneath these shutters a little bit. There we go. And I can use the dark that I already have mixed up. Remember, I had all this mixed for my window opening. Just put a little bit of that on there, and I can come over and capture maybe another window if I miss somewhere. Inevitably, we miss a couple of window openings. I'm just going to throw a few little dark shapes on some of these guys down below here. maybe I've got some windows or something underneath this awning. Just gives me an excuse to put some darks up underneath that awning. And maybe a door or something down here. Doesn't really matter what it is. I just want to give a few suggestions of things down low. Come back in and put some darks in that window just a bit. There we go. All right. We'll put something up in here just to play with it. Let's take a look, pull our camera back, see where we are. Starting to have some nice features, some nice detail, some nice texture with those doors and window openings. None of them are real perfect. They're all just more or less kind of a suggestion. And that's what we're after, is just sort of a suggestion. We don't want it to be too rigid. I'm going to take that same brush I was using for the shutters. I'm going to put a few more little details up that would suggest maybe a bit of the scalloping in this facade. Clean my brush and just soften the bottom edge of all that so it just disappears a little bit. We just sort of seen a hint of some scallops up in that architectural feature. So at this point, I think we should maybe think about our rooftops. Let's talk a little bit about where we're going to go with that. I want to get, I think that my painting that I did originally, the orange got a little dark. I want it to be a little pure orange, a little brighter orange, and we can always come back in and darken in a few shadow spots. But if we start with a purer, cleaner, more transparent orange, I think we're going to have a better overall impression. So I'm going to take my palette and I'm going to clean out some of this green here so I have a place to work and not contaminate my orange with any neutral colors. So I'm just wiping out a couple of spots here where I can mix up some really nice, clean, bright, vibrant orange color. I'm going to use my 3/4 inch flat, and let me see if I can pull this over for you a little bit. I've got a beautiful transparent orange by Schminke, and if I just add water to that and don't get any other colors in there, I have a really, really nice, rich orange that stays orange. Some oranges, like a cadmium orange, when they dry, they go dead. This particular orange that I found really stays nice and bright, and even when it's dry. So I'm going to add plenty of water to this so it's very transparent, but also still very vibrant. I can actually even add a little bit of gamboge to this, which gives it a lighter value. The gamboge is like Indian yellow, so it gives it just a little bit brighter, warmer look to it.
Can you explain what brush you're using now, please, Randy?
Say again, what
Can you
was the
explain
question?
what brush you're using now, please?
It's just a 3/4 inch flat. You can see it's going to allow me to just very quickly put a nice transparent wash over some of these rooftops. And I don't really want to get too dirty. I want to keep it a nice clean rooftop color. And some of these are going to be very light, and some of them will then, after it dries, I'll come back in and put a little darker shadow on parts of that are in shadow. But I'm doing the base color right now to just establish my lightest shade of orange. This looks plenty bright, but it's going to dry very, very pale. So that's why I want to just get this initial color down as a loose, wet wash, and then come back over the top of it with a little more decisive orange. But for now, you can see it even just dropping in a little bit more intense orange in there darkens it very quickly. So we don't have to worry too much about it, getting dimension in here. It'll happen on its own. I'm just going to rinse my brush here a little bit so I have a very pale orange on this part of the rooftop. One back here is going to be very pale, and then I'll come back in and it'll get darker as it comes forward. But for now, I'm just getting this basic color down. I've got a skylight here, so I'm going to leave that as a negative shape. I've got a chimney. I'm painting around some of the chimneys. so that I just basically have my base color working around some of the negative shapes that are features on the rooftops.
Randy, what color was it? It was orange, and what else?
Nothing, it's just orange.
Oh, just
It's
orange. Okay.
trying to
Thank you.
keep it as clean and transparent as possible and light in value, because we will come back and add some darks to this in a moment. But for now, I want these to be really just a pure, clean, transparent orange. Because that's basically your base color. We're not trying to get too fancy here. We're just trying to establish the directionality of all these little rooftops that carry the eye through the painting. I'm going to leave this one side that's facing the sun a white negative shape and just put my orange down on the side that's sloped towards the viewer. And I'll do the same thing as an initial base color to the top of this roof on the tower, just giving us a little bit of orange, maybe a little gamboge. There we go. All right. So we'll let that dry and then come back in and start. I'm going to throw a little bit of color. Whoop. Let that dry, and then I'll add more intense orange in a few places. You can see we're not done, but it's already taking on a beautiful, kind of a nice character to it. You could stop now and have a nice painting, but the darks are what's going to finish this. Without the darks, it's kind of pedestrian. It's a good term. I'm going to take a little bit of raw sienna while I'm waiting for this to dry, and I'm going to drop in a little bit of warmer tone in this one shadow here on this part of the building. I'm not even going all the way out to the edge. I'm just going to leave it kind of over on the left side of this part that's coming down. I want to maybe boost up a little bit of the brown right on either side of this drain pipe, and just give a kind of a random strokes that come down through this building. That warmth kind of pulls it towards us. I'm going to soften that a little bit. And then I want this to be probably a little warmer back in here behind this rooftop. And we'll just let the upper part of that stay pretty light right in the middle there. But where it kind of tucks in behind this rooftop, I'm introducing some raw sienna with a little bit of the cool colors I happen to have, the junk in my mixing well, which neutralizes it. But it pushes up against this other facade a little bit and creates a nice little shadow. And I'm going to carry that right on up with some cobalt and a little bit of the pink. So we get sort of a cool lavender color right up in this little shadowy area. Rinse my brush really well, and then just soften as it comes to the left. What this does is it pushes this part of the building back in the shadows just a little bit. And if that feels too much, just take a tissue and pick some of it up a little bit, but it'll still remain a little darker. And I like the idea of maybe pulling a little bit of this down just to darken the right side of that. And I think I can see immediately we're going to need to darken our hills back there, but that'll come later. And I want to get maybe this facade a little bit warmer as it pushes back behind this little archway. And we can add just a touch of cool, I call it lavender. It's a blue and pink mixture that's cooler, on top of that raw sienna, and it just pushes that whole archway back a little bit. And I'm going to put a little bit of a shadow underneath this cast roof here, just to across that facade. It's very subtle. We don't see a whole lot of it, but it definitely feels like there's a bit of a shadow being cast by that rooftop. I'm going to put a little bit of balcony or something back in there, just a little dark. Doesn't matter what it is, just something dark back in there behind this building. There. And I was talking earlier about this building, I mean, the background. Let's take this lavender that I had mixed up in my palette, just a little bit of cobalt, a little bit of pink, and we'll take that color, add a little bit of lilac to it or lavender to it. And I'm just gonna come back in here with a little bit of dark. And create maybe some shadows on the far hills, whatever it is. But what that does is it just draws our attention to the building. And I'm softening with clean, damp brush that dark shape I just put on there, and allowing some of that to come across as part of our horizon line. Just drag a little bit of water through it so it just disappears. Maybe you can take a tissue and pick a little bit of that up. Maybe just drop a little water in there. See what happens. But see how that bit of dark just makes that tower start to come forward a little bit. I'm going to take a little bit of viridian green, like a hooker's green, add it to that lavender color. Maybe add a little bit of that as part of our features in the background. They're so subtle, we don't really identify them as any particular color, but it just adds a little bit of dark. And I'm going to throw a little bit of water right in this to break this up a little bit so it doesn't look like a brush stroke. All right, there we go. All right, now by doing that, I've allowed my orange rooftops to dry, and we can decide which ones of these are in the shadow. So anything that's sloping away from the light is going to be a little bit darker. I'm going to add just a touch of a burnt sienna or burnt orange, quinacridone burnt orange to the orange. And look what happens when I put a little bit of darker orange on one edge of this, clean my brush, and just push water up against that dark mark. It still stays vibrant, it still stays nice and bright, but it gives a little bit of punch to my orange rooftops. And I'm only going to do this wherever we're seeing, a slope of the roof kind of moving away from the light. And I'll just take water and I'll soften those edges. So it just gives a little bit of a 1-2 punch to that orange without getting too carried away. I'm going to put a little bit on this darker side of this building, maybe up underneath this facade here a little bit, and just add water to it so it has variety within that orange. Maybe add just a touch of darker burnt orange, maybe underneath this guy a little bit. But the key is you don't want to get this too dirty or too neutral. You want to keep it vibrant. You want to keep it bright and transparent. So all we're doing is utilizing the same colors, but less water, a little bit more pigment. And that's what gives it that really nice little glow. Now I'm going to create some shadows with some of these chimney tops, and then take my brush and soften those so they just kind of disappear. But it punches up a little bit of definition on some of these rooftops. And then as some of the rooftops roll away from us, I can take the edge of a flat and I can create a really nice, bright little detail up against some of these nicer rooftops that just kind of pops. Maybe the underside of some of them, maybe behind some of the ridgeline barrel tiles, and we just push a little bit of water up to those, and it just sort of trickles down and gets a little bit lighter. I'm going to get just a touch darker over in this corner here. And because that's wet, if I just drop a little paint in there, it just kind of feathers away. It gives a variety of intensity. I like how that's working. And now there's two rooftops here, like two parallel pup tents or little tent shapes. I want the one that's closest to us to be a little darker. So I'm going to start right on this edge and bring it down, and then clean my brush, push that brush up towards the edge so that the water just kind of picks up that color and softens it without pulling it away from the nice crisp edge. You can even drag a little bit of this way just to make that whole rooftop seem a little bit closer to us, more vibrant. I'm going to get a little bit underneath this guy where some of the barrel tiles are, a little bit of a shadow line there coming up, and then maybe that's so far away, I don't really want this to get too dark. Get this guy. Maybe what we do is we put a few little roof directional things on there. That works. I'm going to add a little bit of glow on part of this facade. Just take a little touch of this and add it to there. Maybe some of it down in this part of the building. Just dragging right across some of these surfaces, but be sure you leave plenty of the light negative shapes. I'm going to add a little bit of warmth down in this hole, kind of down the alley there, and then as it comes up, I want to punch up my lavender a little bit to really push this guy back, make it feel like he's kind of recessed back in there. And that just dropping this wet shape in there is really going to create that impression. I'm going to get a little bit of a darker thing back in here just to create a separation. Something underneath our roof drains. A little bit of orange, darker orange for the shadow behind this chimney shape. Got another one in here. Got one going up this way. I'm just going to have just a hint of orange on that facade, not too much, just enough to tell us it is part of the roof. This gets closer to us, so it'll be a little darker, but then I'm just going to feather away so it gets lighter as it goes up towards that other building. Let's add a little bit of dark, maybe some more lavender behind this rooftop, and then just soften that as it goes up the side of the building a little bit. So it just pushes down behind there. I want to get a little of the same type of shadow underneath this guy, leaving the white facade. And then we'll take a little bit of the orange just to kind of create the edges of the barrel tiles. I think we need to get this a little darker so it feels like it's coming towards us. So I'm just going to get that darker, get this darker, get some darker along the underside of this guy. Same here. And I'm just adding a little bit of water to make this a little softer. And probably need to bring this facade closer to the viewer, so the one behind it feels like it's farther away. See what that little bit of dark does? It just really helps kind of punch things up a little bit. I'm going to add some darks here, a little behind this chimney, a little behind this chimney. Bring this towards the viewer a little bit, right behind that negative shape. Now that orange is serving a purpose. It's bringing this painting to life. I'm going to go up to the top of our tower, and on the right side and the shadow side, I'm going to make the rooftop a little darker, then take a clean brush that's rinsed and just soften the transition to a much lighter orange on the left side of that tower. But using a really pretty saturated, dry brush full of quinacridone burnt orange or burnt sienna, I can make the right side of that rooftop feel a little darker and a little more defined against that light background sky. And it just makes it pop. I might even use a little bit of that same color and drop it into one of these window openings just to add a little bit of warmth within that dark shape. But I want to soften that dark so it just flows within that whole shape and blends with the cool darks that are already there. I think I'm going to add a little bit more Prussian blue over on this side to really punch up that dark shape. See how that dark just starts to make the windows pop. That's about all we got to do there. Now, this window, we can take that same color that we used and maybe drop a little more dark in a couple of spots just to punch it up, squeeze off some of the color in the water and just lighten it a little bit. Come in underneath the roof eaves with some darks. But you can see, now I'm going to put some darks on some of these chimney tops just to kind of give it a little bit of accent here and there. I want to use some nice bright dark orange for the top of this guy and maybe come down the side of that with just a little bit of tone to tie it into the rooftop. So it feels like it's all part of the same structure. And these darks against that light background help pull this forward as a warm color. I'm going to put a little bit of warmth in the shadow underneath this awning, just some of that rooftop color just to let it blend. And it just warms it up, gives it a nice feel. I've got a little bit of a window or something back here. I'm going to add some Prussian blue to a little bit of the orange and just drop in a suggestion of a window or something back in some of these little areas. Just a few little details. Take a little bit of the cool lavender color and push up behind this so it feels like that side of that building is coming forward. Darken this a little bit so this one comes forward even more. And maybe I take a little bit of some grays or something and build some darks behind this balcony for this parapet. Drop in a little bit of color without being, and then just maybe throw a little bit of water on there so it changes it up. Get a little dark underneath it. Push up with a clean brush towards that dark deposit, and it just pulls that balcony away from the facade of the building just by changing value. All right. Now I want to take a moment to step back away from the painting, see what's reading and what's not. We've got a couple of chimneys that are not really reading. We've got a little bit of facade here. I want to make this warmer, I think. My inclination is to put a little warmth on that, pull that down, maybe a little bit in here. Maybe come underneath this little cornice with a little bit of just barely visible warmth, but it just helps to kind of differentiate what's going on. I'm going to bring a little bit of this down and then maybe take a little bit of dark. And you can always, to get a dark color, just take Prussian blue and orange and you've instantly got some nice darks. You can punch up any of the little tops of the chimney tops, maybe roof vents. Maybe you've got a few little details where you've got some darker shadows emerging through this. It just helps to kind of allow for some detailing that otherwise might be missing. So I'm just throwing a few little marks on there, here and there, little rooftop things. And then I'll take a bit of orange and create some shadows that go up. We've got along the ridge lines of these tiles, you can come in just beneath the ridge line and put a little shadow with the darker orange just to kind of suggest that there's some directionality to these, but I wouldn't get too carried away with them. I think it's starting to look pretty good. I'm happy with what we've got. I see one little area where I can put a nice chimney right up against there and then put a little shadow underneath it with some orange. A little bit of the barrel tile roof. And then maybe we got some little dark divots or something where the barrels are. And this just helps kind of loosen things up a little bit. But that orange is what the painting's all about. We had to paint all the other real subtle colors before in order for that orange to carry the eye through the painting. I'm going to take some of this cooler steel blue color, a little bit of cobalt and gray, and just put the edge of this, that's too dark, a little skylight in there. Maybe take a little bit of the top of this chimney. Needs to be more orange. Create these shadows that are coming across. I'm going to rinse my brush and just barely have any orange on it. And I'm going to come in underneath some of these windows with a little bit of just maybe watermarks. That's all they are. Just things that help differentiate. I'm going to create a cooler facade around this awning so that the awning looks a little brighter. Take some beige and pretty imperceptible, but what it did is it left that awning a true white. It reads a little better. You can also, at this point in the painting, go back with your rigger and pick up a little bit of, what colors have we got here? Let's get a little sap green, maybe. A little bit of Prussian blue. The Prussian blue, takes it down a little darker. And maybe we just tap a little bit of these dark splatter into some of the vegetation. And leave that alone. I think we can also come back up and punch up a little bit of our tower shape. Clean our brush and just soften the underside of those marks. So we really feel like there's some nice, strong architectural features there without being too obvious. Just a suggestion. See if I can get down and see that a little better. But you get an idea how this is starting to read, bringing the eye up this pathway. I can take a little bit of the burnt sienna, put a few little suggested stripes on here where the barrel tile detailing might be in your rooftop. Maybe we got a little bit on here. Doesn't need much. Just a few little things to suggest what's there. If you do too much, it might be overkill. Just a couple of little details. But I think that, I'll put a little window or something up in here just to suggest that there's a dark there. So there you go. Trying to decide where to sign this. We have a darker area here. If I were to use a white gouache, we could probably put white against the dark, and it would read as additional texture without being too, distracting. I just have to find some pigment here to use. I think I found it. Here we go. If you use white gouache or Juan Brilliant #1, which has got a lot of gouache in it, I like to be sure I clean it out of my palette really well after I use it, because otherwise you'll contaminate your transparent pigments with the gouache. So if I put a little squirt of this, I'll move my camera over here. This is just permanent white. Put a little bit of that in my mixing area. And then I'll take a rigger and I can mix that up so I get a nice charge of that on my brush. Not too wet, because it'll dilute and go really faded on you. I can even pick up a little bit of green tint to that, so it's not so harsh. And then I can come back to my painting over the tree where it's really nice and green. And I can come right in there on top of that and just add a signature that basically has a lot of the same texture style as the rest of the painting without distracting from the painting. Clean that all off your brush real well. Take a tissue with a little bit of water in it. Get all that out of your mixing well so that you don't leave a residue of gouache behind, because you'll regret that immensely later. But any questions at this point about where we went with this painting and how we accomplished what we did? We've got a nice lead in here with the dark. It kind of comes up. It also mimics where we're going with the rooftops, but that orange is what is so warm. Everything else has sort of a coolness to it, which, if you recall, we went back and used the cobalt and a little bit of a pink, cobalt and lavender. Had a lot of really subtle, cool colors that created our facades by still maintaining a negative shape. The orange caps off the tops of these vertical facades. The green vegetation was dark and cool for the most part, and it really captured the outer edges of a lot of the facade to kind of give us the shape of this grouping of buildings that are all together. We've got a darker rooftop against a very light background, creating value contrast. The dark windows create value contrast. This darker orange beneath this tower creates value contrast. All of these things are designed so that they bring your eye kind of in a nice little pathway of stepping stones across these rooftops up to this tower, which is the strongest feature in the painting. Now I'm looking at this background here. Do I want to make that a little darker? Maybe we do. The painting is now pretty dry, so I could come back with a little cerulean blue and a little bit of that green, and maybe I come back in and really darken this up quite a bit. Maybe I just put a little more dark around the tops of these buildings, take a clean brush, rinse my pigment off and just feather that away. But that dark that I just put in there is so subtle, you'd hardly recognize that I put anything in there, but it's serving a purpose in that it's creating more value contrast. I can even do the same thing over here just by creating a little bit of value contrast up against this facade, and then clean my brush and soften those edges so that they just kind of fade away. But what have I done? I've pushed a cerulean blue and a little bit of the green mud that's in my palette, and I've created this stronger value up against the building itself. And I've created a really more of a recognizable negative shape. Then I come back in with a clean brush after I rinse my brush, and I just soften all this dark mark and blend it right into the background. So you hardly even notice that I've gone back in and intentionally darkened either side of that negative shape, but it draws our attention to that building facade that is the important feature that we're, the whole painting's about. I'm going to come back in and add a little bit more intense quinacridone burnt orange or burnt sienna right up underneath this cornice, just to suggest that there's a stronger feature there that we need to emphasize. I can always clean that up a little bit if it needs to be straightened. But you get the idea. It's something that you get to play with. It's your painting. You get to design it however you want. There's no rules. There's no, we're taking some liberties from our photo and creating something that's a little more value contrast, a little more white and light and dark. And it's not all the same midtones all the way through. This kind of bothers me, this line that's cast shadow across here. I'm going to take a damp brush and just break it up a little bit. I can still have it there, but by breaking that up, it doesn't draw attention to it. It just makes it more subtle. And so there's my painting.